Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest ALTA Insights webinar. I'm Jeremy Yohe, ALTA's Vice President of Communications, and today we've got a really great presentation lined up to help you learn about organizations tracking and mapping discriminatory covenants. And we're also going to discuss how title and records industries are collaborating to identify these discriminatory covenants and help property owners address them. Before starting, I need to touch on a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. You'll get a link to the recording tomorrow, as well as a link to access the presentation. You can always access all of our webinar recordings at alta.org/webinars. That's alta.org/webinars. In the meantime, you can also download a PDF of the presentation from the handout section in the GoToWebinar window. If at any time you have any questions, submit them through the questions box. We'll hold a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. As a reminder, today's webinar, we are offering CE and CLE credit for many states. Credit's only available for those attending the live presentation, and our platform tracks attendance. To meet state compliance, there will be a few poll questions sprinkled throughout the webinar, so pay attention and no multitasking out there. At the end of the presentation, I'll post a link in the chat box to access a survey, and you can, not a survey, but to SurveyMonkey, and you can provide your information that we need to report your CE and CLE credits. Send us an email at education@alta.org if you have any questions for that. I do need to thank F&F family of companies for sponsoring today's webinar. And before introducing Elizabeth Riley, I have a short message from F&F.
In this business, we're always weathering a storm. From staffing issues in technology to regulations and winds of economic change, we have a lot to deal with. You need a bigger net. Lean on F&F, whether you're in calm seas or battling a storm of your own. We have the largest fleet of underwriters in the country. We're here with the agency tools you need to succeed today. Contact your local F&F rep today to set sail.
All right, well, let's set sail with today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Riley. First, Liz is Senior Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer for Fidelity National Financial. In her role, she manages F&F's information privacy program and advises the company on compliance with federal and state statutes and regulations concerning data protection, privacy, and information governance, and data breach response. Liz is involved in several ALTA committees and serves on the Discriminatory Covenants Work Group. She is also co-chair of ALTA's Data Privacy Work Group and a member of the DEI Advisory Council, Government Affairs Committee, Public Affairs Steering Committee, and State Legislative Regulatory Action Committee. Liz, you definitely stay busy with all things ALTA. So thank you for your leadership. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for all of you for joining us today. As we in the title industry know, racial and discriminatory covenants can still be found in the property records of communities across our country. While they're no longer enforceable, the remnants of these discriminatory policies continue to have harmful impacts today. We get to learn today about Mapping Prejudice, an important organization whose mission is to track and map discriminatory covenants, exposing their scourge on our land records and the structural racism the covenants represent. We also get to hear about partnerships among the title and records industries with Mapping Prejudice. This is an important initiative that we in the title industry can be a part of. And so we're grateful to each of the speakers today for their willingness to share what they're doing, their experiences with us, so we can know how we can join the effort. Our first speaker is Kirsten Delegard. Kirsten is one of the founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project, which identifies and maps racial covenants and collaborates with other groups and communities to expose the history of structural racism and support the work of reparation. Kirsten originally trained as a women's historian and explored the history of women in politics in her early research. More recently, she has devoted her energy to public history and unearthing the complex past of her hometown. This focus led to Mapping Prejudice and the Historiopolis Project, which Kirsten also founded. Also joining us today is Amber Bouget. Amber is the recorder and registrar of titles for Hennepin County and Minneapolis. Minneapolis is the county seat and the state's most populous city. In 2021, Amber became the first woman appointed as recorder and registrar of titles for the county. Prior to being named recorder and registrar of titles, Amber served as chief deputy recorder for 8 years. And last but not least, certainly is Wendy Ethan. Wendy is the owner of Guarantee Commercial Title, as well as an attorney and a certified real property law specialist. Wendy launched Guarantee Commercial Title in 2004 with a focus on significant transactions and complex commercial financing structures. Wendy's passion is affordable housing work. Wendy serves on ALTA's Abstractors and Title Insurance Agents Section Executive Committee and the Research and Analytics Committee. She is also a member of the ALTA Discriminatory Covenants Work Group. Kirsten, I'll turn it over to you to start us off with the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Let me just show my screen here. Can everyone see that? Is that working? Yeah?
Yep, it's working.
Excellent. So thank you so much for having me here today to share the work that Mapping Prejudice has been doing to illuminate how race has shaped access to housing in Minnesota over the last century. So our work began in 2016 when I came together with a small group of researchers to start Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota Libraries. So our team wanted to do something that we didn't know at the time, no one had ever done before, and that was to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for the country. So we were focused on using public history and digital mapping to explore a central question. And that is, how did Minnesota develop some of the largest racial disparities in the country? Specifically, we were really interested in one statistic, and that was, which is significant for all kinds of reasons, and that is the racial gap in our home ownership rates. So the Twin Cities has the highest gap in the country between Black and white homeownership rates for any community in the country, for any metropolitan area in the country. And what does that mean, or what are those numbers specifically? It's that 75% of white families own their own homes, while only 23% of Black families can make that same claim. So housing, of course, I don't have to tell this group that housing is essential. It's the foundation of everything else. It determines whether or not you're going to be healthy or sick, what kind of access to education you might have, whether your family will be able to amass wealth, and of course, whether you will be able to pass that wealth on to the next generation. So I'm trained as a historian. So I was really focused on trying to look to the past to understand the present, to figure out how we got to this place. And this focus, this examination led our group, my group of colleagues, collaborators, to what we have now come to see as a critical turning point in Minnesota. And that was the decision to use private contracts to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. So, as you all know, these private contracts that we're talking about are racial covenants. So they were clauses that were inserted into property deeds, and sometimes written on plat maps and other places, to keep people who are not white from buying or occupying certain pieces of land. So who was responsible for this? So many different groups, of people. They were written, they were composed, and they were promoted by a huge cast of characters, realtors, city planners, bankers, people in the title industry, academics, elected officials. And there was a consensus in a lot of these professional organizations for most of the 20th century that these were really important and valuable tools. But racial covenants, of course, were not the only thing that were used. They worked in concert with other things like white violence, real estate steering, and redlining. And I'm going to talk about all those things a little to keep people who are not white from owning land and houses. Oops. So in Minnesota, or in Hennepin County, where we started, the earliest covenant that we have found was put in place in South Minneapolis in 1910, and that's this document that I put here on the screen. It documents a transaction between Henry and Leonora Scott, who sold a property on 35th Avenue South to a Swedish immigrant named Nels Anderson. So this was not a particularly fancy house or exclusive property in any way, but it did have this racial restriction, which I have reproduced here, that stipulated that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So we actually know who wrote this particular covenant. We know that it was a man named Edmund Walton, and he started with this covenant, but he didn't stop here. He inserted this exact same language into thousands of other deeds in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. And once this language was in place in Hennepin County, dozens of other landowners, developers, and city officials followed Walton's lead, and they composed dozens of variations on this language and inserted it into the property record. So I'm going to read a couple of examples here. We do this in every presentation, but I want to forewarn you that it's disturbing. So this covenant was put in place in 1946, and it said that, no person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. Another one said, the said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And another very common covenant that we found, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant. So these words are hard. These words are hard to hear. It's disturbing, but we do it in part because, well, for me, I do it because I think it's really important to bear witness to this practice. So I think it's really important to speak this history, to not leave this as a silence. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made covenants illegal across the country. And once that happened, there was really a rush to forget, especially among white people. And what our project is doing, one of the things that Mapping Prejudice is doing, is that we are trying to peel back what we have come to see as this willful amnesia. We want to empower communities. We want to be with communities as they're engaging in a collective remembering of this history. This is really foundational for racial justice. And we're also creating data that we hope will be used to drive change. So some of you, it seems in this group, it seems unlikely, but some of you might be hearing about racial covenants for the first time. And for you, I think it's really important for me to emphasize that there was nothing secret about these restrictions when they were in place. Racial covenants were printed in newspaper ads for new housing developments. They were featured in the plot lines of books and plays and movies, and they were the subject of countless studies and news reports. So studies about covenants stories about covenants also were passed down through families. So white people may have been in a hurry to forget about racial covenants, but the memory of these restrictions was definitely kept alive in Black families, in Native American families, in Asian families, and in Jewish families. But even with all this, even with this rich record of memoirs and narratives and activism, there was so much that we didn't know about racial covenants when we started mapping prejudice. Really basic things like what did covenants actually say? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they cover? And so we started trying to answer those questions, and we were so lucky that we happened to start this work in Hennepin County. And this is true for a couple of reasons. One, the property records in Hennepin County had just been digitized when we started this work. And second, the people who worked in the recorder's office in Hennepin County are incredibly professional, skillful, and committed to public service. They were immediately supportive of our efforts. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we couldn't have succeeded without this person, Jesse Schlisner. Jesse was our initial contact in Hennepin County, and he worked with us at every turn to get the public documents that we needed for this work. Jesse is also like such an aw shucks guy. He's so modest. He would be quick to say, "Oh, it wasn't me," and of course that's true. It was also Amber Boucher, who is here with me today, and the other folks who led the work of digitizing the records, and not only digitized the records, but did it in such a way that they were widely accessible to the public. Without their generosity and their faith and our good intentions, I can say it would have been totally impossible for us to go through the iterative process that we had to develop the co-creative, community-powered mapping methodology of our project. So what Jesse did is he arranged to transfer copies of Hennepin County's digitized property records to the University of Minnesota libraries. And this allowed us to take an entirely new approach to some of these questions that had vexed researchers for over the last century. These digitized copies allowed us to figure out how to use Python scripts and optical character recognition to comb through millions of property records and flag the documents that seemed to have this racist language. And then we were able to, we took those records that had been flagged by computers and we took them to the community. We harnessed the power of volunteers and our community members. We put these records into a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And then we invited volunteers into the work. So for our Hennepin County map, we had 3,000 volunteers read 177,000 historic property deeds, and they identified 24,000 property parcels with racial covenants in Hennepin County. Then we expanded our geographic focus to include St. Paul, where we worked with our partners at St. Catherine's University to recruit an additional 3,000 volunteers, and this is in the height of the pandemic lockdown. And for that work, our volunteers reviewed 250,000 deed images and donated close to 21,000 hours of labor to this work. So when we put all of that information on a map, all the work of our volunteers, this is what it looks like. So what you're looking at is you're seeing the spread of racial covenants through Hennepin and Ramsey County through time. You can see the years ticking by in the upper right-hand corner there. And each one of these blue dots denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for the use of white people. So again, we didn't know this when we started, but no one had ever created a comprehensive map of this kind before for any American city. And seeing all of these individual documents on a map really changes the way people understand this history and understand this practice. Again, like I need to go back to this map is only possible because of our partnership with county recorders, first in Hennepin County and then in Ramsey County. And Amber's going to talk more about this, but I want to emphasize that this collaboration has been hailed as a success by all kinds of observers, including the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information, which made Hennepin the first county in the state to be recognized with a Finnegan Award which comes from journalists who highlight work that defends, quote, the public's right to know in a way that makes a difference in Minnesota. So it's been 6 years since we started the work, but we're just beginning, really. Now we're trying to take the process that we developed in Hennepin and Ramsey counties and see how it works in other places that have different systems for recording property records. So we currently have property records from Dakota, Anoka, and Washington counties in Minnesota, and we're working on getting them ready for volunteers this winter. And we would also like to expand our work to move into more rural parts of Minnesota. So we hear from people around the state that they've encountered covenants in every county, but no one has ever done a systematic search for these restrictions in rural property records. So again, I don't need to tell this group that racial covenants were used in every community across the country. And the reason for this is that they were promoted through national institutions. So every public and private institution that was involved in some way with the buying and selling of land or real estate promoted covenants. So one organization that was really important in this regard was the National Association of Realtors. After its founding in 1908, NAR helped to develop covenants and write templates for covenants, which they touted as a way to protect property values. And it was the same logic that was adopted by the federal government in the 1930s when new programs when it was developing new programs to support home ownership. And it was at this point that federal policymakers began to make covenants a requirement for favorable lending terms. So here's a page from the 1938 Federal Underwriting Manual. So it states that the most favorable rates should only be granted, quote, where effective restrictive covenants are recorded against the entire tract, since these provide the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. So in other words, developers that were looking for federally subsidized financing had to use covenants. So covenants became a federally mandated best practice for anyone doing residential real estate developments. So this requirement really pushed covenants into every community across the United States. So that's why we are working with other researchers across the country to map covenants. We're sharing resources and tools with teams that are working in Iowa, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., Michigan, Chicago, Virginia, and Seattle. And right now, we're actually working with a team in Milwaukee to map covenants there, and we need volunteers. So this is a QR code that will bring you to our the part of our website where you can find out how to volunteer, and we try to make it very easy. You don't have to. You can do it from home. You can connect to our website, which provides step-by-step instructions. So we do weekly online volunteer sessions that you can join, or you can just follow our steps online and do it sort of on your own time too. So why do we do it this way? I mean, we're looking for help generating this data set, but I would say the main reason that we do this is that our volunteers tell us what a powerful experience it is. That it really opens people's eyes to this history and its connection to the present. I would also say that it really works well to do this with a group. So if you have a group, either a faith organization or a group of people who are interested in exploring this history together, you might consider signing up for one of our volunteer sessions together, because our sessions really do provide a safe space for learning more. So I'm going to let Jeremy hop in here for a second.
Yep, thank you, Kirsten. Here's our first quick poll question. If you could mark yes or no if you've encountered any of these just discriminatory covenants in your public records in your county. Take a few seconds here and we'll get back to the presentation. Kirsten, that was a fascinating map on how these covenants kind of evolved in Minnesota. As a populated. It was interesting to look at. Yeah,
no, it's pretty. We call it our like it comes from a public health model, and we call it sort of it's our contagion map, right?
Yeah. All right, we're going to close the poll. 73% of those who responded said yes, they have encountered these covenants in their land records.
Wow. Well, thank you. I'm really interested in hearing more about what these look like across the country. So thanks to all of you for coming. Okay, so yeah, we're working across the country with groups of researchers, and our goal is to create a national data set that we hope will help us understand the damage that was done and also drive meaningful change. And again, I want to emphasize, as we've done this work, we've found that the process of doing the work of mapping the covenants in collaboration with community members is as important as the product. So that this, the creation of the data set has been a powerful vehicle for policymaking, for research, and community conversations. So you might be wondering, why do we need to be having these conversations? Why is it important to know if these things have been illegal for so long? So covenants are illegal today thanks to the legal campaign of the NAACP, which worked through, conducted a very effective and methodical legal campaign, which culminated in the Shelley v. Kramer decision, Supreme Court decision in 1948 that made covenants unenforceable, and then carried through to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So the question is, why do we care? Why do we need to know about these restrictions when we have both laws and policies that make them illegal? And I would say for many years, historians ended the story of covenants with this landmark legislation. So covenants, this is a story that people told. Covenants were terrible, they were racist, but it happened in the past. And American values prevailed. Our institutions bent the arc of history towards justice, end of story. I wouldn't be here today if it were the end of story, of course, because there's more. And I'm here today because we're living with the legacies of these practices. So I'm going to offer you some insights that we've gleaned from our work in Minneapolis, where our data set is most developed. But I always want to emphasize that we learn as much from groups like this about the ongoing legacies of these practices. So covenants were one of the driving forces in Minneapolis that transformed a relatively mixed integrated city into a segregated city. So one of the things that covenants did is they really emboldened white Minneapolitans to harass Black residents, to push them out of neighborhoods that were coming to be seen as all white, and push them into just a few small areas in Minneapolis. And then as new neighborhoods were developed, they were gated, they were restricted with covenants. And what we know by overlaying the covenants data on contemporary demographic maps is that the areas that had covenants are still the whitest areas in Minneapolis today and in the surrounding area today. And then the parts of the city where that were racially mixed, where Black people were allowed to settle after 1910, they were redlined. So that's the federal practice that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous investments for lenders. And this really choked off capital to these areas and had all kinds of repercussions. So it's these three things together: covenants, redlining, white violence, made it really hard for people who are not white to find a place to live, to find stable, affordable housing, and certainly to buy homes. So just with that background, I think I would like to tell you my personal story. That this story is not something this is not just an academic project for me, but I'm writing about my hometown here. I'm researching my hometown. So the story is very personal to me. So I'm a third generation Minneapolitan. And at the same time, in the same moment that residents of South Minneapolis were terrorizing Black families who were trying to get established or who were moving into the city, they were welcoming my grandparents. So my grandparents were immigrants with roots in Sweden, and they started their adult lives with very little education and very little money. Two of my grandparents were actually orphaned at young ages. None of my grandparents made it past the 8th grade. And they worked jobs like they were farmhands and domestic servants and lumberjacks and carpenters. And they worked all over the region around Minneapolis in small towns. And then they decided to come and try their luck in the big city in Minneapolis to see if there's more opportunity. And indeed there was. And in some ways, their lives were sort of the classic American immigrant story. During the Great Depression, both sets of my grandparents built businesses, they got married, they saved their money, and in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses, actually in the same neighborhood in South Minneapolis. So what you're seeing on the screen here is this is a family movie, a family film. I used to call it a home movie until people explained to me that my grandfather must have hired a film crew to record this moment. This is the housewarming party that my grandparents threw when they bought their house in 1942. And the film actually goes on for hours. And you could see that my grandparents invited everyone they had ever known who wore their best clothes and came to celebrate this incredibly important moment for my family, where my grandparents became homeowners. So my grandparents clearly wanted to share the joy and the pride that they felt in becoming homeowners in Minneapolis. So thanks to our work, I now know that this house had a covenant. So what you're seeing here, the black icon on that map marks my grandparents' house, and the red that you see is all covenants. So my mom grew up nearby, and it was the same story. So although my grandparents were new arrivals to the United States, they were regarded as white. And we know actually that homes with covenants were marketed to immigrants like my grandparents. This is an ad for the Coma Park neighborhood in St. Paul from a Swedish newspaper, and it prints out the text of the covenant in Swedish, assuring buyers that the developer, Thomas Frankson, who would go on to become the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, would enforce covenants to the fullest extent of the law. So the fact that some new Americans were seen as white meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans with similar income and education. So I grew up spending lots of time at my grandparents' house and listening to stories about what it was like to grow up in this neighborhood near Lake Nokomis. My uncle and my parents described it as a wonderful place to be a kid in the 1950s. There was tons of parks. They could spend all their time outdoors, swimming in the lake. And really importantly, the neighborhood had really solid schools, which prepared my parents for college. Both of my parents went to college, even though their parents had not gone past middle school. So what I never heard from my family was that this was only for white people. So my parents say that they just never questioned why their neighbors were all Swedish, Norwegian, and German, and that this uniform whiteness seemed utterly natural to them, even though now I know as a historian that the number of Black people in the city was increasing dramatically. So my grandparents bought their houses just at a critical moment, at a moment when the United States was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. And much of this new prosperity rested on homeownership, which had, of course, been supported by a whole plethora of new federal programs in the 1930s. So these programs created the modern mortgage, which allowed many, many more people to own their own homes. They also promoted redlining. So these programs baked structural racism into their algorithms, which meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy homes in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. So our research shows today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Minneapolis that had covenants like the one my grandparents owned are worth 15% more than identical houses that never had a covenant. So my grandparents were able to pass this additional value on to me, When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and distributed the proceeds among the grandchildren. I was able to use that money to put a down payment on another home in another part of South Minneapolis that has all the things that my parents emphasized as being super important to their happiness and well-being when they were kids. Green space, solid schools, easy access to the lakes in Minneapolis. And the realtors on this call can testify to the fact that I'm fortunate but not exceptional, that a large portion, at least 30% of new home buyers get this kind of help from their families to manage the purchase of a first home. So like many of my peers, I leverage the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. So we talk about this as a family. I always tell my kids that we carry our history with us. Even if we don't know what it is, we're carrying this history. We're not always aware of what happened before we were born, but it still is with us. So what we're trying to do with Mapping Prejudice, with our map, is we're trying to help everyone see this history and help people identify with this history in a really personal way, to locate ourselves in this history. And working with volunteers, our volunteers have taught us so much about why it's really important to read these primary sources, to read these historic deeds in terms of helping them understand structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. So racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not just the sentiments of people like these protesters who picketed the Minnesota state hearings on fair housing in 1962. Most often it's just not this obvious. We want people to understand that racist ideology has been embedded into community institutions over decades, that it's been written into our foundational documents in our communities. And the reason why this is important is that this history helps us to understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity. The system is working as it was designed. It was designed to prevent Black and brown people from owning a property. So what do we do now? How do we change course? The first step has to be remembering, and that's what you're doing today with us. So this is part of the process of reparations, which Ta-Nehisi Coates describes as the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. But we have to do more than that. We have to change material conditions. And I think, again, I look to history to offer an example of possibilities. So in the 1930s, the federal government decided to really go in with supporting home ownership. In 1930, only 30% of Americans owned their own homes. By 1960, more than 60% of Americans were homeowners. So this shift was fundamental in terms of fueling the expansion of the middle class in the United States. It fueled the prosperity that made the United States the envy of the world. So policies matter. We can change course. We can change structures. We know that these earlier programs, the benefits went largely to whites. And so I think that, clearly the challenge is, how do we replicate this earlier success in a more inclusive way? And what role are you going to play, right? So in my work as Mapping Prejudice, I'm using the tools that I have as a historian to make change. I'm here as a truth teller. I am talking about who we are as a community and what we've done. But I'm here with all of you in this space because this is how I generate hope to move forward. So what tools do you have, and where can you put them to work? So I'm handing the baton to you. How do we make meaningful change? What are the institutions and organizations where you have influence, and what needs to happen? So with this, I'm actually going to hand it over to Amber, who's going to talk about how recorders can support this work. And she's also going to talk about our work together with Just Deeds. So Amber, I'm going to hand it to you.
Great, thanks so much, Kirsten. As Kirsten stated, I'm going to talk about the ways recorders can support and be involved in this important work. First, by providing data and collaborating with research organizations like Mapping Prejudice to illuminate these past practices. Second, by framing legislative initiatives in ways that support the work. And finally, by supporting others who are working with homeowners, providing education and sparking action. Next slide, please. I recall the first time I met Penny Peterson, one of the Mapping Prejudice researchers, and how shocked I was by how many of these covenants she was uncovering in our records. As Kirsten stated, over 24,000 have now been mapped for Hennepin County. It was a no-brainer for us to support this work. Penny became a regular in our research area, and we even provided her with one of our vacant cubes to work in. When Mapping Prejudice approached us about broader access to our records, we worked with our county attorney on a memorandum of understanding regarding the images we were sharing. Those specific images shared were based on an analysis we did with Mapping Prejudice to identify what records would provide them the most benefit. We then provided the images on a set of hard drives that were then returned to us. And then from there, as Kirsten talked about, Mapping Prejudice used technology to create the maps that were shown earlier. Because of my predecessor and his predecessor's foresight in digitizing all our documents, we had no additional monetary outlay, and our resource efforts have been minimal, including limited involvement from IT. If our documents weren't digitized, this research and resulting map wouldn't have been possible. Understandably, some counties have not had the opportunity to invest in this endeavor. It can be time-consuming and requires funding. Our digitization efforts lasted from 2008 and finally ended in 2015, with just our grantor-grantee indexes left to image now. We have many phases of this project over these 7 years and continue to benefit greatly from those efforts through the online subscription service and electronic recording. Many land record jurisdictions are digitizing their records, and this sets the stage for providing data which can be used in identifying discriminatory covenants and spatially representing them with GIS software. In addition to providing data to organizations like Mapping Prejudice, recorders who are already collaborating in this work can share their experience with other recorders. Jesse Slicener, our Chief Deputy Recorder over Records, who you saw earlier, and I are happy to provide more information on our processes for this work. Just reach out to either of us. Next slide, please. In 2019, after the unveiling of the Mapping Prejudice map, identifying specific Hennepin County properties with covenants, Minnesota Representative Jim Dabney discovered a discriminatory restrictive covenant on his Minneapolis home. As a result of this, he proposed a bill to allow homeowners to disavow restrictive covenants through the recording of a discharge document. The initial draft bill led to conversations amongst those of us in the Minnesota land and title property records industry as to the effect of the recording of this document in the land records. This group worked through various issues regarding the form to be recorded, as well as the terms that were used, including the implications of any removal or redaction to documents from the land records. Ultimately, the final bill was put into law. It was codified as Minnesota Statute Section 507.18. This law allows a homeowner to record a discharge with the recorder's office. This discharge acknowledges the discriminatory covenant and reiterates its unenforceability, but it preserves all other aspects of the document. Representative Dabney expressed that the discharge process also provides a way for our community to have a conversation about the history of racial discrimination in housing in Minnesota and how it impacts our families and communities today. This slide shows the form that's used, and although the statute provides for a fee, many counties in Minnesota, including Hennepin and Ramsey, are waiving it to facilitate recording. Other Minnesota counties are following this trend. Our website provides details of how a homeowner can begin the process of researching and discharging these covenants, including links to the mapping prejudice dataset and a sample of the form. Hennepin County has recorded about 500 or so of these so far. And for Torrance property, our examiner of titles has issued at least 214 directives removing reference on a certificate of title to a document that includes a discriminatory covenant. Next slide, please. In 2020, the city of Golden Valley developed the idea for the, yes.
I need to jump in real quick here. We got one more poll question to ask here, and then I'll let you get back. Sorry.
All right, thanks.
All right, here we go. Let me launch this question here. Just does your county have a system in place to help identify discriminatory covenants? So don't mind taking a few seconds here. Let us know, and then we'll get back to Amber. A few more seconds. Got about 20% say yes. The rest, no. So go ahead and close this. Thank you. And Amber, back to you.
Great, thank you. In 2020, the city of Golden Valley developed the idea for the Just Deeds project, and they organized the Just Deeds Coalition, which is active in communities all over Minnesota. This slide shows the founders as well as the participating cities, and Mapping Prejudice is also a founding member of the Just Deeds Coalition. Next slide, please. They are a coalition of stakeholders who have pledged to work together to identify and dismantle structural racism in the spheres where they have influence. Just Deeds assists homeowners in discharging racially restrictive covenants, educating communities and individuals, and investing in solutions that create equity. Our office refers homeowners to and publicizes Just Deeds on our website for not only for assistance in completing the discharge form, but more so for the value of the education provided by Just Deeds. They educate Minnesotans about racist practices perpetrated by developers, real estate agents, lenders, lawyers, and local, state, and federal governments to establish segregated housing and keep wealth and opportunity away from communities of color. They also educate Minnesotans so they can understand who has directly and indirectly benefited from historically racist practices and how those practices have shaped access to property, homeownership, and wealth over time. They're taking action to dismantle those racist systems that perpetuate inequality and are devoting resources to create equity for communities of color. They also provide speakers to address neighborhoods, schools, or community groups. Their website is an outstanding resource for education and information and is a great base for anyone interested in creating this type of grassroots effort in their own community. Thank you for allowing me to share some ways that recorders can support these efforts. And I'm now going to turn it back to Elizabeth, and she'll be talking with Wendy about how the title industry can be involved.
Thank you, Amber, and Kirsten, thank you as well. We've learned so much so far. So with our limited remaining time, Wendy, we want to hear from you as a member of the American Land Title Association and a title agent. Just tell us about how you and Guarantee Commercial Title have been helping in these efforts.
Well, Guarantee has been involved with the Just Deeds program in Minnesota since it was started in 2020. We originally received a call from one of the attorneys who was helping the city of Golden Valley and starting Just Deeds. And we were trying to identify resources in our community and to figure out the most efficient way to help the participating cities and residents get the research that they needed on their properties. As you see from the form, there's specific detailed information that needs to go on the form that gets recorded. And so we're now the piece of that puzzle that can provide that information to the cities and the residents. As Kirsten and Amber have also discussed, finding that information can be time consuming and costly. And Just Deeds ended up asking each title company that had expressed an interest in helping with this work. They assigned us each to a different city or a couple of cities. We took 3 to be the title company kind of record, to be the go-to resource each time a resident would make a request for help. In that case, the city would contact us. We would prepare a title commitment free of charge. And we specifically were looking for the covenants and documents that may contain the discriminatory language. As you saw from the maps, they identify the areas and where all the racial are. Then we pull the actual documents so that we have the information to fill out the form to get recorded. In addition to my company's work with Just Deeds, I also got involved with the ALTA efforts. I'm super passionate about creating more inclusive communities, so this was a natural fit for me to help take this effort nationally. I'm lucky to live in the Twin Cities, I guess, and also after listening to Kirsten's story about her family, my first house that I owned was also in Richfield, Minnesota. I didn't grow up here, but I moved here after college. My aunt and uncle co-signed for me so that I could buy that house. So I have a similar story and benefits of being a homeowner in Minnesota. I've owned houses here ever since. I was lucky to know about Mapping Prejudice, and I followed their work all along. And so once ALTA suggested that we meet with Mapping Prejudice, I was on board. We realized in our first conversation that the title industry and our association could be a great way the word. And then we also realized that, we were kind of doing similar work in, many different areas around the country. We just didn't have a way to coordinate all.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I mean, what you told us a little bit about, how important this is for you personally and your company to be involved in this work. How do you see, how would you recommend that others in our industry get involved and how best to go about kind of finding ways we can help?
Well, I think there's a number of ways to get involved, and I'm sure that people on this, listening to this webinar, I hope your wheels are turning about what resources you have that you can donate to this effort. As Kirsten said, use the tools that you have and put them to work. This work has been really important to my team at Guarantee. It's really easy for us to get involved. We have, title companies aren't the most exciting places to work. Not sure why, frankly. I love it. I think it's really fun. But anytime that we can find a way to use our specific skills and our knowledge and access to tools to do good work in our community, we jump at it. And this is like a no-brainer. This is something that we are uniquely able to do, is to help out in this effort, and it speaks to me and my coworkers. We're super involved in this. Just Deeds is in addition to what Amber spoke about, it's a coalition of individuals and companies that are organized to provide free legal and title services to help property owners in cities denounce these racial covenants. And so it's very easy for us to get involved. I think, you can start talking about this in your community. And state and county will have different recording systems, access. Some have discriminatory covenants. Minnesota is one of those places. Some may have less. Think about what you know and have access to as a title company or a county recorder. You might have a title plant that you could offer to a Mapping Prejudice project to use for free or for a limited cost for this limited, could you provide some of your coworkers a volunteer opportunity, like Kirsten mentioned too? What a great way for us to get together and use our skills and spend time helping our communities. It's also, you know, frankly, it's a way to provide your employees or your coworkers with some meaning to their work. This is a really stressful time in our industry. We've been struggling with maintaining employees for a long time. Now we're struggling with a downturn. Use this as a tool to engage your employees and have them be motivated to help their community as title people.
Thanks, Wendy. That's awesome. So I know, I mean, you've inspired me, Wendy, Amber, Kirsten, to see what I can do to help and to get involved. And I'm sure others on the call feel that way as well. So thank you. And I think at this point, Jeremy, we can turn it to you if there have been questions that have come in.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Liz. And Wendy, yeah, great advice on how title agents on the call can get involved in this in their markets. We do have some time, a few minutes here for Q&A. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please submit them in the questions box. In the meantime, I am going to post the link for your CE/CLE if you need to submit information for that. And as a reminder, if you have any questions for education credit, send an email to education@alta.org. We are getting a lot of questions rolling in. Some just kind of comments. You know, Larry says we see quite a bit of this in our South Florida plants. It's an interesting one. You know, all female panel. Have you seen covenants that prohibited women from owning property in the neighborhood? You know, very specific there.
I don't think so. No, what we usually see, honestly, is we see women owning property, and this was a tactic where that families would use to protect assets. So if the husband was in business, he would put the house in the wife's name to keep it from being claimed if there was a bankruptcy, for instance.
This is a question from not me, but from Jeremy. And Jeremy, we may have to follow up with you following. Does anyone on here happen to know the states that mandate these covenants to be redacted within a certain time frame? I don't know about a certain time frame, and I think in California they have their legislation that was enacted earlier this year that requires, you know, counties to take action. But I'm not aware of any other states.
Yeah, I mean, so everyone who's on this panel, we've had these discussions about redaction of racial covenants, and one of the things that we have all been trying to work around is advising policymakers on how to write this legislation so it's not ultimately destructive, you know, for very cumbersome and onerous for recorders and people who work in the industry, but also so it doesn't foreclose the possibility of this future research. So I think we're fortunate, but we're worried about new legislation coming through that would require redaction. You know, that people think that is going to ultimately serve the cause of justice, and one of the messages that we've tried to be really clear about is that it will not do what you think it's doing. So and again, like the California law, it does talk about redaction, but I think people are interpreting it in different ways. That the language is a little ambiguous, and we hope that people will be interpreting it to mean not redaction and just some kind of you know, recording of where these covenants are. And of course, we are happy to help with any of those efforts that are happening around the country.
And Kirsten, another question for you, and this comes from Margaret. You know, kind of is like, what's next? We collect the data, and you see where these covenants exist, and how ownership has been hindered against, you know, certain segments of this country. You know, how do we go about moving forward? You know, does mapping prejudice do anything? You mentioned it briefly about reparations. You know, is there any efforts there going forward? Anything you can share with people on the call?
Yeah, I mean, what we say is that we're one piece of the puzzle. Again, like I always talk about, working in collaboration. We're researchers and not policymakers, and we hope that we're providing data that will help people, that will help people craft policy that will really change these patterns in a significant way. And again, we are very clear that Mapping Prejudice, we're making a case for reparations. What those reparations look like, we believe needs to come in conversation with the people most affected by the problem. The people who have been hurt by these these racist practices over time. Like, what do people need now to actually repair the harm? I don't think there's we know there's not a one size fits all solution. There's not one policy that we're going to be able to enact. It's not a matter of just cutting a check. It's changing structures. And I think everyone on this call knows how complex all these structures are and how interlocking they are. It's not going to be just you change a zoning ordinance and that's going to take care of the problem, or you have a new form in your mortgage disclosure. I mean, it's a lot more complex. So again, like, we're going to keep trying to foster these conversations. We're going to keep producing data that we hope people in a wide variety of fields are going to be able to use to push through meaningful and targeted change. So what's next? I think I'm going to throw that back on the audience. What is next?
And I know we are at the top of the hour. One more interesting question I want to pose to the group, if you don't mind. And Dion asked, how do we deal with white flight if Black and brown home ownership exceeds 20% in a neighborhood? Any thoughts on that?
Can I, since I've been doing all the talking, I feel like I want to hand this off to my co-panelists.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if any of us have the answer to that, but there's a lot of discussion about it. Welcome to Minneapolis, where we test our tornado sirens at 1 o'clock on the first Wednesday of the
Hey, Wendy, I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and ours are at noon, so that's why we have webinars at 1.
But I'd love to talk about that problem. Wants to join our Alta committee or reach out to me individually.
Yeah, Wendy, you cut out a little bit, but I think what you said was get involved with an ALTA committee. Definitely participate and sign up and volunteer your time on this discriminatory work group. You and Liz are both part of that and doing great work. We're working with organizations like Kirsten's and counties, and with recorders like Amber. So yeah, start there, get involved, and use the tools that you have that you also mentioned, and see if you do have any staff, any employees that this is a passion of theirs, and see if they can carve out a little bit of time to dedicate to this. We have went over a few minutes, so I apologize for that. If you missed parts of today's webinar, or if you think others in your office would benefit from listening, just a reminder, you'll get a link to the recording tomorrow, and all of our webinars are archived at alta.org/webinars. A link to your CE/CLE to submit information for that is in the chat box. And we do need to thank FNF once again for sponsoring today's webinar. And with that, that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.